As a teen in New York City, Robin led a pretty active life in high school, which included a number of crushes on boys. But when she went to college, she discovered she had this wicked, crazy crush on another female student, and she didn't really get it. She didn't understand it. She had heard of both the words lesbian and gay, but she wasn't sure that they applied to her. Well, at that time in her life, she was journaling a lot. So she journaled feverishly about her feelings, trying to process it. And she says she wondered, well, what was her new and exciting crush on a woman real? Well, if that was real, then what about all those crushes she had on the guys in high school? Were they fake? Were they just premature, perhaps? A way of her body and her mind testing the waters of sexuality, leading her to the river of lesbianism. And how did she fit into the expectations of society, she thought? It seemed the world wanted everyone to fit into some sort of a bipolar model. You're either female or male, or black or white, or Democrat or Republican, or straight or gay. But this then, of course, was 1969, which was a huge time of experimentation, and it seemed like everything was being recreated. So bravely, within the first few months of starting college, she came out as bisexual, a term that seemed to fit her feelings and desires pretty well. Okay, so now Robin had a label for herself, because it's really important that everybody has a label so you know how you fit in, right? But the label didn't necessarily help her feel accepted or whole. There was in fact, back then, and this was cutting edge, there was a brand new gay and lesbian advocacy group on campus. And she walked by it 1,000 times without ever going in, because it was clear that to go in there, you had to either be gay or lesbian. You couldn't be somewhere on a spectrum between lesbian and straight. Well, frankly, this spectrum didn't even exist yet. So Robin continued on with life as the only bisexual she knew, and felt alone and pretty broken about it. Well, eventually she moved to a new community in Massachusetts and got herself a crappy apartment, that's her words. And while taking a break from painting it, she stumbled across an ad in one of those neighborhood flyers that it was about a women's bisexual group starting up. And their first meeting was that night. Well, she was so excited that she spent hours, she says, getting all the paint out of her fingernails and out of her hair and her eyelashes and her chin, because she wanted to make sure she made a really good impression. And so she showed up at the appropriate time and place, and lo and behold, there were 40 women there. Now she says 38 of them were like her, bisexual, and one lesbian was just cruising for dates. She was beside herself with joy. She said her cheeks hurt because she was smiling so broadly for 2 straight hours. These were her people. She was no longer alone with her sexual identity, and she didn't feel broken anymore. A small group of them actually started meeting regularly. And someone would open up their home for a potluck. They would eat, they'd talk, they'd laugh. They just loved being together. And eventually, some of them would start the small grassroots publication. It's more of an anthology kind of thing, which is now actually the longest lasting and only known publication for bi women in the world. And it's still edited by Robin today. This is the early story of Robin Oakes. And all of this information came from an interview on LGBTQ plus history she gave with a student, Megan Foley, as part of her senior project in December 2017. It was titled, How We Got Here. So Robin is someone whom I think personifies the idea of taking an uncomfortable part of who she is, a bit lonely and broken about it, and turn it into something that shines like gold. Or in her words, when I talked to her about using her story for this today, she goes, gold and glitter. So from her bio on her website, it says, Robin Oakes is an educator, speaker, grassroots activist, and editor of Bi Women Quarterly and 2 anthologies. The 42-country collection, Getting Bi, Voices of Bisexuals Around the World, and Recognize, the Voices of Bisexual Men. And advocate for the rights of all people of all orientations and genders to live safely, openly, and with full access and opportunity. Robin's work focuses on increasing awareness and understanding of complex identities and mobilizing people to be powerful allies to one another within and across identities and social movements. In fact, Robin was recently named by Teen Vogue as one of the 9 bisexual women who are making history. Robin is someone I am honored to call a friend. She reached out to me a couple of months ago to let me know she was going to be conducting a workshop at Kimberly-Clark, my former employer, which is where Robin and I first met. She asked if I wanted to set up an additional free workshop for the community since Kimberly-Clark was paying all the expenses. We did this the last time in Appleton a few years ago and over 100 people showed up. So working with Christopher Simzik, we now have Robin coming to Open Circle on Wednesday, September 25th for a workshop. And I hope you can all come and bring a friend. Robin is a very energetic speaker and you will not be disappointed. The title of my sermon today is Kintsugi, the art of wholeness from brokenness. And Scott actually gave me the Japanese symbols down there of what it looks like, written. And as you can see from what I've got for an image up here and with some of the images in the Peter Mayer song we played earlier, Kintsugi is the art of covering cracks in ceramics with gold. They also used other precious metals, but gold is the most common. So to understand it more, I went to Wikipedia, of course, and got a little bit of the background. So the first thing you need to know is that lacquerware is a long-standing tradition in Japan. And actually this art isn't necessarily just Japanese. There's places where it's always also been done in China, Vietnam, and Korea. But Kintsugi in Japan has become closely associated with the ceramic vessels used for Japanese tea ceremony. And one of the possible origins, I don't know if it's true or just an urban myth, is this. It's a theory that it originated when the Japanese shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa sent a damaged Chinese tea bowl back to China for repairs in the late 15th century. Now, when it was returned, it was repaired with these really ugly metal staples. And the theory is that the Japanese, who had a little bit better aesthetic than that, started thinking, well, what can we do instead of repairing it in such an ugly way? And so they tried to come up with a more aesthetic means of repair. Well, it caught on. And there was a rumor that collectors that had some fine pottery started smashing them on purpose so that they could get them fixed in gold because this kintsugi was becoming very popular. Now, it's also related to a philosophy. Kintsugi can be seen to have similarities to the Japanese philosophy of wabi-sabi, an embracing of the flawed or the imperfect. The Japanese aesthetics values marks of wear in objects. And so they like to think of it as, well, this is just part of the life that this object has had, rather than just throwing it away because now it's broken or not perfect any longer. In fact, Christy Bartlett wrote a book about this Flickwerk, the aesthetics of mended Japanese ceramics, and this is what she says. Not only is there no attempt to hide the damage, but the repair is literally illuminated. A kind of physical expression of the spirit of Mushin. Mushin is often literally translated as, quote, no mind, but carries connotations of fully existing in the moment, of non-attachment, of equanimity amid changing conditions. She goes on to say, the vicissitudes of existence over time, to which all humans are susceptible, could not be clearer than in the breaks, the knocks, and the shattering to which ceramic ware, too, is subject. This poignancy or aesthetic of existence has been known in Japan as mano no aware, a compassionate sensitivity, or perhaps identification with things outside of oneself. Well, before I go on, I kind of have to call out the story I read in the Time for All Ages this morning. It happened to be part of the curriculum we were using, The Most Beautiful Bower in the World. But I had a little bit of trepidation about reading it today because it was honoring perfectionism. The most beautiful. Well, the story comes from the world of wonder, and it's designed to highlight the interconnectedness of all existence, our seventh principle, and leaning into it. But unfortunately for today's topic, I'm afraid it focused on a bird who needed to strive for perfection before he could find a mate. The author of the story anthropomorphizes actually the bird by having it think, I'll do better next time. Now don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with self-improvement, but in my opinion, that little guy was beginning to equate his self-worth to the degree of creativity involved in that bower he was making and his dance. And of course, taking too far, that can lead to feelings of isolation and brokenness. I just had to throw that out there because it was an interesting story for today's topic. But let me give you some personal examples that I feel of how I related to isolation and brokenness. I think a lot of you can relate to this. It's that 2 a.m. you're worthless syndrome. So you went to bed, you fell asleep, but for some reason, you've had a busy week and something's bothering you and you wake up at 2 a.m. And for me, this little voice starts and it sounds something like this. You're worthless, you didn't finish that sermon. You're worthless, you forgot to respond to that email. You're worthless, you didn't take out the compost and rats are going to infest your kitchen. Or you're worthless because maybe one of my friends or acquaintances said something odd in an email to me the day before, and at 2 a.m. I'm convinced they never want to see me again. These are all the cracks and brokenness and unworthiness I'm sure many of us often feel, even if it isn't at 2 a.m. or the middle of the night for you. And then we pull ourselves together in the next morning and try to hide our cracks and present ourselves as a nearly perfect piece of pottery. I think the source of this anxiety probably dates back to my father. I grew up with a father whose favorite quote was, perfect is plenty good enough. Now he himself was far from perfect, but he wanted his children to strive for perfection. When I was a teenager and a young adult, I fell into a familiar pattern of perfectionism. I was paralyzed from making decisions or starting anything that I didn't feel I could do perfectly right out of the gate. That meant I withdrew from life, from my fullest potential. Now, as a mature adult, I see that it may have been even to the expense of wholeness in life overall. I also see now the common ways I failed his idea of perfection, ways in which he probably thought I was broken, are actually now some of my strengths. For example, I have this classic personality type that dreams big and doesn't let the naysayers and details get in the way of a perfectly flawed plan. During my career as a manager, I learned that this flaw or broken part of my personality needed to be compensated by the talents of others. I surround myself with others I trust a lot and who love those kinds of details. I think of it as a crack in my personal pottery, the brokenness of my essence, but it's been painted with the gold of collaboration instead. It wasn't a flaw after all, just part of my personality that needed to shine through so that others would notice and lend assistance. Well, that was sort of like turning lemon into lemonade analogy, but there's another way to look at it. Leonard Cohen states there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. I love that image, and I think of it as a light of hope. It's a very communal, very pastoral image. Something may have happened to us that makes us feel very broken and alone, and at times like these, we can always draw inwards, hide into the recesses of that dark pot. But Cohen reminds us that once that crack is there, the light's going to get in. I think of it as the light of hope from a community that holds us, comforts us, and tells us we have worth, even though we might not feel it at that time. Friends, that's what our fellowship is for. We exist to hold up the community in the warm glow of love and acceptance. In fact, we use the lighting of our chalice to remind us of this main tenet of our faith. If you remember, the first line of our opening words go like this: we light our chalice as a symbol of the warmth of our community. Well, today I want to close with a ritual that reminds us of the wholeness in our fellowship community that supports us. The Reverend Beth Lefevre has written a beautiful piece I'd like to share, and I call this a liturgy of wholeness. I'm going to say a few sentences here, and if you'd like to participate, I'd appreciate it if you would respond, "We are whole." So let me practice that here. We are whole. All right, very good. Let us begin. We are whole even in the broken places, even when it hurts.
We are whole.
We are whole even in the broken places, the places where fear impedes our full engagement with life, where self-doubt corrupts our self-love, where shame makes our faces hot and our souls cold.
We are whole.
We are whole even in those places where perfectionism blunts the joy of full immersion into person, place, activity, where good enough does not reside except in our silent longings, where our gaps must be fast filled with substance, accomplishment, or frenzied activity, lest they gape open and disgust.
We are whole.
We are whole where we would doubt our own goodness, richness, fullness, and depth, where we would doubt our own significance, our own profoundness.
We are whole.
We are whole even in our fragility, even where we feel fragmented, alone, insubstantial, and insufficient.
We are whole.
We are whole even as we are in process, even as we stumble, even as we pick ourselves up again, for we are whole, we are whole.
We are whole.
Just as the Japanese bowls are made of whole with gold, may we always return to wholeness through the hope and warmth of this fellowship. Ashe and Amen. And on that same theme, I want to go right into our closing